Hello, you're listening to Rot-Weiss-Rot Report, the podcast for those who live and work in Austria. Every week, we bring you the most important news, clearly and concisely, so you stay informed about key changes affecting your work, your documents, and your everyday life. In today's episode, the government is cutting university funding, prompting thousands to take to the streets. How will this affect students and patients at university hospitals? A major healthcare reform. How is it proposed to restructure hospitals so you can see a specialist faster? New polling data. How do Austrians feel about migrants, and do they want stricter rules for them? Why do you pay more for the same products in Austria than in neighboring Germany? And is there any chance of changing that? How does the government plan to protect family budgets from electricity price spikes? And what risks does this pose for industry? All this and much more, coming right up.
Let's start with the most important story, the one that truly shook the country last week. A standoff broke out between Austrian universities and the government over money. On 27th of May, it escalated to the point where thousands of people, from first-year students to professors, took to the streets in Vienna, Graz, Linz, Salzburg, and Klagenfurt. The rallying cry was the hashtag Unis retten, meaning Save Our Universities. Why are so many people so upset? The government has unveiled its budget plans for 2028 to 2030, in which universities are allocated just 15.5 billion euros. That is, first of all, 1 billion less than they currently receive. And second, universities had actually requested an increase to 18 billion euros just to stay afloat in an environment where everything is getting more expensive, from utility bills to laboratory equipment. Factor in inflation, and what the government is effectively doing is cutting their funding by nearly 14%. What are the consequences? When universities don't have enough money, they make cuts. For instance, entry into popular programs could become even more competitive. If places in laboratories or on courses are reduced, universities will simply raise the bar on entrance examinations to filter out more applicants. Funding also directly affects the quality of education. Less money in the budget means fewer teaching staff. And there is another dimension that matters not only to students. University hospitals, such as the renowned Allgemeine Krankenhaus der Stadt Wien, Vienna General Hospital, are not merely research institutions. They are places where thousands of real patients come every day. A hole in university funding also means fewer junior doctors in training, fewer physicians overall, and even longer waiting times for tests and appointments. It is therefore perfectly understandable that people are angry. And yet, despite the protests, Science Minister Eva Maria Holzleitner has so far not made any concessions. The final word now lies with Parliament, which has a few months to deliberate before announcing its definitive decision. Meanwhile, Austria's entire healthcare system is in urgent need of reform. The Austrian Court of Audit, the Rechnungshof, has published a report in which it concludes unambiguously that the way the federal government, the individual states, and the health insurance fund, Gesundheitskasse, currently operate is simply inefficient. Here are the hard numbers. In 2024, the state spent 44 billion euros on healthcare. Yet waiting times for doctors have only grown longer since then. Finding a doctor who works under the public insurance scheme, a Kassenarzt, has become a genuine quest. At the same time, different hospitals are duplicating each other's services, wasting billions of euros in the process. The Rechnungshof has therefore issued a firm demand. By 2028, decisions must be made that bring about real change, not just change on paper. In total, the experts have proposed 15 concrete steps. For instance, shifting the focus to general practitioners, Hausärzte, and merging smaller hospitals into large medical centers. A practical example of what this could look like can already be seen in Lower Austria, Niederösterreich, in the town of Stockerau, where a large hospital is under construction to replace 3 smaller facilities. Another expert proposal is to bring hospitals under centralized management. At present, Austrian healthcare is effectively governed by everyone at once: the federal government, each individual state, and the insurance funds, all with their own interests and budgets, spending money haphazardly, while the patient often ends up a hostage of the system. The auditors are proposing that control be placed in one set of hands, so that funding flows not to wherever it suits local politicians, but to wherever it is actually needed. These are, of course, sweeping changes, and they will be debated at length before any real reform begins. But if nothing changes, the state will continue spending billions, and you still won't be able to get the care you need on time.
Austria is also in the grip of a record drought. On 26 May, the meteorological agency Geosphere Austria published data on groundwater levels and precipitation. This spring has been one of the driest on record across 169 years of observation. Rainfall has been 50% below average. The situation is most severe in Upper Austria, Oberösterreich, Salzburg, and Carinthia, Canton, where the soil has dried out to such an extent that groundwater reserves cannot replenish fast enough. This is not merely an unpleasant fact. It is a genuine threat to the upcoming harvest, which could soon hit prices for locally grown vegetables and cereals noticeably harder, and will also raise the risk of forest fires. Against this backdrop, environmental organization Greenpeace is demanding that the government start conserving water. What exactly are they proposing? Let us say up front, nobody is planning to cut off your tap water. But the state should carry out a comprehensive audit of industry and large agricultural holdings, which consume a disproportionate share of resources. Among the proposals are also a tax on excessive water use and the creation of a public register showing who is consuming how much water. We emphasize again, this concerns production, large companies and holdings, not ordinary consumers. But the drought will make itself felt for everyone. Certain individual states may therefore introduce restrictions, for example on watering lawns or filling swimming pools. Another major and sensitive topic, migration. 2 events dominated public debate in Austria last week. At the end of May, a court in Klagenfurt handed down a verdict against a 24-year-old Syrian national who carried out a terrorist attack in the town of Villach a year ago. According to the investigation, he is a follower of the Islamischer Staat, Islamic State, also known as ISIL, which is banned in Austria and in most countries that uphold basic standards of human rights. 5 people were injured in the attack, and 1 teenager was killed. The death toll could have been higher, but the attacker was stopped by an ordinary man, another Syrian migrant, as it happens, who witnessed what was happening and drove his car into the perpetrator. On 27 May, the court found the terrorist guilty and sentenced him to life imprisonment. The very next day, the Landesgericht Wiener Neustadt, Regional Court of Wiener Neustadt, passed sentence in another high-profile case. 2 21-year-old men were found guilty of planning a series of terrorist attacks, including an attempted bombing of a Taylor Swift concert in Vienna in August 2024. They received sentences of 15 and 12 years respectively. Such cases, understandably, provoke a powerful emotional response in society. In the wake of high-profile crimes, people become acutely sensitive to questions of security, and debates about migration grow even more charged. Against this backdrop, the right-wing populist Freedom Party of Austria, The Freiheitliche Partei Österreichs, FPÖ, continues to press for tougher migration policies. Party representatives argue that the current system is ineffective and are calling for tighter border controls, limits on irregular migration, and a revision of asylum rules. They also insist that the state should only accept the kind of migration that, in their view, aligns with Austria's economic and social needs. Interestingly, polling data suggests that such calls find support, at least among a segment of Austrians. According to a Gallup study published at the end of May, 64% of respondents consider the current migration policy insufficiently strict. A majority of those surveyed also expressed concern about the impact of migration on safety and cultural life in the country. Meanwhile, around 3/4 of respondents backed the idea of restricting family reunification through a quota system. It is worth bearing in mind, however, that any opinion poll reflects people's sentiments at a specific point in time. And in the wake of major news events and high-profile trials, public opinion tends to become more emotionally charged. That is precisely why such figures reveal not only attitudes towards migration, but also how society responds to events that provoke fear, anxiety, and a sense of uncertainty.
And to round off, a story relevant to everyone who drives or is planning to buy a new car. From 6th July, new vehicle safety requirements come into force across the European Union. From that date, all new car models must be technically equipped to support the installation of what is known as an alcohol interlock. That sounds complicated, but the principle is very simple. An alcohol interlock, alcohol sperr system, works like a breathalyzer. Before starting the engine, the driver must take a test. If the system detects that the alcohol level exceeds the permitted limit, the car simply will not start. Let us reassure you straight away, this does not mean that every driver in Austria will be blowing into a tube every morning before heading to work. The new rules only require manufacturers to make cars ready for such a system to be installed, should that prove necessary. Why is this being done? The reason is straightforward. Authorities across many European countries are looking for ways to reduce alcohol-related accidents. Austria has been experimenting with this approach for several years. Drivers caught behind the wheel while intoxicated for the first time were in some cases offered an alternative, either a lengthy driving ban or the installation of an alcohol interlock at their own expense. The results proved fairly convincing. Drivers who used the system were significantly less likely to reoffend with drink driving. That is why these technologies are now gradually becoming part of pan-European rules. For the vast majority of law-abiding drivers, these changes will go virtually unnoticed. But for those who get behind the wheel after drinking, the consequences could become far more tangible. New cars will already be primed for such controls, making it far easier to enforce court rulings and restrictions on offenders. So the key idea behind the new rules is rather simple. If you've been drinking, the car won't go. With the big stories covered, let's move on to what everyone feels in their wallet. We're talking money and the economy.
We begin with good news for those working in Austria's electrical and electronics industry. After almost 3 months of grueling negotiations, trade unions and employers have finally agreed on a wage increase. The agreement was signed on 28 May and covers approximately 60,000 workers across Austria. If you work in electronics manufacturing, electrical engineering, industrial equipment, automotive components, or at a company that falls within this sector, this news may well apply to you. Let's break down what is actually changing. First, the so-called Tariflöhne, the minimum wage rates that employers are legally required to pay under the collective agreement, Kollektivvertrag, will rise by 3%. Crucially, the increase applies retroactively from May 1st. meaning workers will receive back pay for the time they have already worked since that date. In addition, actual wages will also rise. This varies depending on the individual company and the terms of its collective agreement, but increases of up to nearly 3% are possible. There was also agreement on additional benefits for long-serving employees. Workers aged over 40, or those who have been in the industry for more than 20 years, will receive additional paid days off, referred to as Gesundheitstage, literally health days. These can be used for rest, recovery, or dealing with personal matters without any loss of pay. Why did this agreement matter so much? Because the negotiations were extraordinarily fraught. Trade unions and employers could not reach agreement for almost 12 weeks. Employers were insisting on a rise of just 1%. The unions flatly refused and began preparing for strike action. Workers' meetings were held at numerous companies, employees voted on potential industrial action, and employers found themselves under increasing pressure. According to union representatives, a compromise was reached literally at the last moment. The talks stalled several times, and both sides came very close to a large-scale labor dispute. For many workers, this story served as a reminder of the role trade unions play in Austria. It is through collective agreements that wages across different sectors are regularly reviewed here. And it is through precisely these kinds of negotiations that workers often receive pay rises even when the economic situation remains difficult. If you work in this sector and are unsure whether the new agreement applies to you, it is worth contacting your company's Works Council, the Betriebsrat. And if your workplace does not have a Works Council, you can contact the trade union GPA, Gewerkschaft der Privatangestellten, Druck, Journalismus, Papier, directly to find out exactly when you can expect the recalculation and how the new rules will affect your pay.
Now to a story that may appear at first glance to be remote from the lives of ordinary people, but which in fact affects many families in Austria. On 27 May, the government announced an expansion of the support program for industrial enterprises. In plain language, the state will continue helping large factories cover their electricity and gas bills. Why did this become a problem in the first place? After the energy crisis, electricity and gas prices across Europe rose sharply. For an ordinary household, this meant higher utility bills. For large factories, it meant millions in additional costs. This hit energy-intensive industries particularly hard: steelworks, chemical plants, manufacturers of building materials, glass, paper, and other industrial goods. For companies like these, energy is not a secondary line item. It is one of their primary costs. And when electricity bills double or even triple, some enterprises begin operating with almost no profit or at a loss altogether. That is why warnings from major businesses have been growing louder lately. Company executives have been saying openly, if producing goods in Austria becomes too expensive, some production could be relocated to countries where electricity is cheaper. And this is precisely the point at which the story starts to concern not factory owners, but ordinary workers. Because when a factory closes or scales back production, the first people to suffer are those whose jobs disappear. And that means not just engineers and managers. It means production line workers, forklift operators, warehouse staff, cleaners, security guards, logistics workers, office employees, and many others. The government's logic, then, is this: spending budget money now to support businesses is cheaper than paying unemployment benefits to thousands of people in the event of mass redundancies later. How does the support work? Companies do not receive money automatically. They must demonstrate that their financial situation has deteriorated substantially due to high energy prices. The state can then compensate part of their electricity and gas costs. The support is not available to everyone indiscriminately, but primarily to enterprises that are most dependent on energy resources and provide a significant number of jobs. The government acknowledges, however, that constant subsidies are not sustainable. That is why another significant change was announced simultaneously. Large enterprises will be able to install their own energy sources more quickly. For example, solar panels on factory rooftops, wind turbines, or other energy systems directly on company premises. The idea is to make factories less dependent on fluctuations in electricity market prices. If a company partly provides its own energy, it is less vulnerable to future crises. Will ordinary people notice these changes tomorrow? Most likely, no. Wages will not automatically rise because of this, and your rent or utility bills will not become cheaper. But this news matters for a different reason. It shows that the government is currently seriously concerned about the state of Austrian industry and is actively trying to prevent factory closures and job losses. For many migrants, this is especially relevant, since a significant proportion of foreign workers in Austria are employed in manufacturing, logistics, and related industries. So when the state talks about supporting industry, it is, in effect, also talking about preserving the livelihoods of tens of thousands of people.
Another piece of economic news. A new study from the Arbeiterkammer, or AK for short. Arbeiterkammer, the Austrian Chamber of Labor. This is one of the largest organizations in Austria dedicated to protecting the rights of workers and consumers. Their experts compared prices for identical branded products in Austrian and German supermarkets. And the results were deeply uncomfortable for Austrian shoppers. On average, the same products in Austria cost approximately 26% more than in Germany. Some items showed an even wider gap. For example, certain types of crisps were priced nearly 93% higher. Coffee capsules were more than 80% more expensive, and some products cost almost twice as much. One important clarification is needed here. This does not mean that every single product in Austria is 93% more expensive. That is how attention-grabbing headlines often frame it. In reality, this refers to specific items. The average difference was considerably smaller, around 26%. The Arbeiterkammer also compared not random products, but the same brands in specific stores. The study used online prices from Billa and Interspar in Austria and the Ruwe and Globus in Germany. So this is not a story about one country selling premium goods or different quality. The comparison was made on as like-for-like a basis as possible. And now the key question. Why does this matter to so many people? Because many people living in Austria have long had the sense that going to the supermarket has become a painful experience for the wallet. This is especially true for families with children, pensioners, and people on lower incomes. The problem is not just that products are expensive. Many people can see that the very same goods often cost noticeably less just across the border in Germany. As a result, growing numbers of residents in border regions have been traveling across the border to shop. This is precisely why Austria has, for several years, been home to a debate about the so-called Österreich-Aufschlag, the Austria surcharge. This is the term used to describe situations where international producers sell the same goods on the Austrian market at higher prices than in other EU countries. At the same time, caution is warranted when drawing conclusions. There is as yet no evidence that the entire price difference is explained simply by greed on the part of supermarkets or producers. Prices are also influenced by logistics costs, rents, staff wages, competition among retail chains, and the specific characteristics of the market itself. But the fact remains, the price gap exists, and it has been recorded by independent studies more than once. This is being raised not only by the media, but by the Arbeiterkammer and other consumer protection organizations. Will anything change in the near future? For now, it seems unlikely. But the topic has already reached the level of the Austrian government and the European Union. Mechanisms are currently being discussed that could limit such price disparities between EU member states. And for ordinary people, this story matters for one simple reason. It confirms that the feeling of, "Why is everything in the shop so expensive again?" is not just an emotion. Research shows that in many cases, residents of Austria really do pay more for the same products than shoppers in Germany.
But last week also brought positive financial news. On 28th of May, the Austrian government announced the introduction of a new mechanism to protect consumers from electricity price spikes. In plain terms, the state is putting a safety valve in place for the scenario in which energy market prices shoot up again. How will it work? A price ceiling is being set at 10 cents per kilowatt hour, excluding taxes and grid charges. This rule will apply to the basic volume of electricity that is typically sufficient for a family for 1 year. If the market price for electricity remains high for more than 3 months, the government will automatically freeze your tariff at the 10-cent level. So even if the energy market goes haywire, the tariff for a typical household's basic electricity consumption will not exceed this ceiling. Why is the government taking this step now? Because recent years have shown that the energy market has become extremely sensitive to any international disruption. Any trouble in the Middle East, and gas prices, and consequently electricity prices, can double overnight. For the government, this is a way to avoid widespread public anger from citizens who are already exhausted by the relentless rise in costs. However, a serious conflict of interest lurks behind this decision. Energy companies are opposed to such a price ceiling. They are openly arguing that if the state artificially limits prices, they lose the profits they had planned to reinvest in building new solar parks and modernizing power grids. In essence, the government is choosing between cheap electricity here and now and the development of green energy infrastructure in the future. Does this mean bills will fall in June? No. This is a protective mechanism that will only kick in the event of a new crisis. But for ordinary people, the news matters for a different reason. It signals that the state acknowledges a reality. Electricity prices are no longer predictable, and without direct government intervention, price turbulence could become financially unsustainable for many Austrians. This mechanism is currently the subject of intense debate, as the authorities try to balance the interests of consumers who need to make ends meet and energy companies who need to build infrastructure so that Austria does not remain dependent on imported energy. For many workers, this is also a signal of stability. The government is trying to keep utility costs under control, so as to prevent a new wave of inflation that would definitively erode real incomes.
And now, the most important part of our program. Not just news, but information that could directly affect your life in Austria today, or in the very near future. The Austrian Parliament, Nationalrat, has recently passed a package of amendments to migration law, approving legislation that brings Austrian rules into line with the new European Pakt über Migration und Asyl, EU Pact on Migration and Asylum. That sounds complex, but let us put it in plain language. Over the past several years, the countries of the European Union have been working to agree on common rules for migration and asylum. Those rules are now being gradually introduced across all of Europe. The aim is for a person applying for asylum in any EU country to go through the same procedures, whether they are in Austria, Germany, France, or Italy. That is why Austria is now rewriting part of its own legislation. What does this mean for you personally? If you already have protection, a residence permit, or a stable legal status, there is no need to panic. Your documents will not be automatically invalidated. But if you are currently in the middle of an asylum procedure, have recently filed an application, or are only now planning to do so, the rules may change gradually. This could affect how cases are processed, document checks, decision timelines, and certain border procedures. That is precisely why it is especially important right now not to rely on social media advice or information that is 3 years out of date. Please bear in mind that migration law across Europe is going through one of its most significant periods of reform in recent years, and information must be verified through official sources. Let's move on to the second piece of news, which may be of particular interest to those planning to build their future in Austria through work. On the same day, Parliament adopted amendments to the Niederlassungs- und Aufenthaltsgesetz, Settlement and Residence Act, the law that governs the residence and employment of foreign nationals. In brief, the state is attempting to make the system more transparent for the people Austria is trying to attract to its labor market. This applies above all to holders, or prospective applicants, of the Rot-Weiss-Rot Karte, red, white, red card. For many migrants, this card is the primary route to long-term life in Austria. It allows you to work and reside in the country legally at the same time. Previously, people frequently complained about complicated bureaucracy, mountains of paperwork, and lengthy processing times. The authorities are now promising to simplify certain procedures and make them more straightforward. If you are currently looking for work in Austria, planning to relocate for employment, or already preparing your Rot-Weiss-Rot Karte application, make sure you check the updated requirements. In some cases, this could save you both time and considerable stress. One more topic that concerns a great many of our listeners: family reunification. Unfortunately, the situation here is not straightforward. The rules are also changing, and legal experts are currently carefully analyzing how exactly the new provisions will work in practice. If you are planning to bring your spouse or children to Austria, please do not rely on the experience of acquaintances who went through the process a few years ago. Even if someone managed it via a certain route in 2022 or 2023, that does not mean the same rules apply today. Before submitting any documents, it is essential to verify the current requirements or consult a specialist.
And finally, a topic that many people are very interested in, but which still receives less attention than it deserves: Austrian citizenship, Staatsbürgerschaft. No new rules have been adopted yet, but a political debate is ongoing, and it could affect thousands of migrants. Today, obtaining citizenship in most cases requires demonstrating a B1 level of German. For many people, that is already a serious challenge. But in political circles, there is growing discussion about potentially raising the requirement to B2 or even C1. To give you a sense of the difference, B1 is the level at which a person can hold an everyday conversation, handle most practical situations, communicate at work, and generally live independently in the country. B2 is a very different matter. You need to be able to confidently engage in discussions on complex topics, read the press without significant difficulty, understand most television programs, and express your views with ease. And C1 approaches the level of a well-educated native speaker. Why are we raising this now? Because many people have been putting off applying for citizenship for years. Some are waiting for a better job. Some are planning to improve their German. Some simply think, I'll apply next year. But migration rules have one distinctive feature: they can change. If you already meet all the current requirements for Staatsbürgerschaft, you have the necessary period of residence, a stable income, and a B1 language certificate, it is worth at the very least checking whether you are eligible to apply right now. Not because everything will change tomorrow. Nobody knows that. But because indefinitely postponing important decisions is not always the best strategy. And on that note, let us turn to the news from the capital, quickly and engagingly as ever.
Before we move on to city news, let us briefly return to the topic of university protests, which we covered earlier. This story matters not only because of the money and the funding cuts. It showed how seriously Austrian society takes education and science. By various estimates, around 28,000 people took to the streets of Vienna, and for a working day, that is truly remarkable. Even more striking was that the protest was backed by organizations with completely different political leanings. University groups that normally argue amongst themselves found themselves on the same side for once. In Austria, that is quite a rare situation. That is precisely why many commentators called this protest one of the most significant public demonstrations of the year. And now, quickly and clearly, the main events, news, and changes. From 28th May, a new payment system called Tap und Ride has gone live across the Vienna Metro, U-Bahn. You can now buy a ticket in literally a few seconds. No ticket machines, no cash, no rummaging through your pockets for coins. Special terminals have already been installed at a number of stations. Simply tap your bank card, smartphone, or smartwatch using contactless payment. Wait for the green signal, and off you go. Your device then effectively becomes your ticket. By default, the system purchases a standard single-journey ticket within Vienna. If you are traveling with others, you can buy up to 5 tickets at once via the terminal screen. There is one important detail to note. If a ticket inspector approaches you, you need to show the specific card or device you used to pay. Paid with your phone? Show the phone. Paid with your card? Show the card. For now, the system is operating in test mode at 9 major stations, including Stephansplatz, Westbahnhof, Hauptbahnhof, and Schwedenplatz. There are no additional fees. The price is the same as buying a standard ticket through Wiener Linien, Vienna's public transport operator. So if you use Apple Pay, Google Pay, or a smartwatch for payments, getting around on Vienna's metro has just become a little bit easier. Meanwhile, Vienna Pride 2026 officially kicked off on 29th May. The program runs for over 2 weeks until the 14th of June. In Austria, this is not just a festival. It is one of the biggest public events of the year, drawing hundreds of thousands of people annually. What makes this year especially significant is that the Regenbogenparade, Rainbow Parade, is celebrating its 30th anniversary. Organizers are therefore expecting a particularly large number of guests and participants. The main event will take place on the 13th of June along the Ringstrasse, Ring Road. However, this year's celebrations are not without difficulties. Due to cuts to the city's budget, funding for Vienna Pride has been reduced by almost half. As a result, organizers have had to scale back part of the program. For example, the traditional Pride Village at Rathausplatz, Town Hall Square, will only run for 1 day this year instead of 3. For many Viennese, this is one of the most beloved parts of the festival, as it hosts concerts, community organization meetings, and cultural events. Despite this, organizers assure everyone that the centerpiece, the Regenbogenparade itself, will go ahead in full. Over 300,000 participants and visitors are expected. Even if you are not planning to take part in the parade itself, it is worth being aware of it from a practical standpoint. There will be significant road closures in the city center, and public transport will be under heavy strain. For many migrants, Vienna Pride is also an opportunity to witness one of modern Vienna's defining characteristics: a city that strives to be open to very different people and communities. So if you find yourself in the center on the 13th of June, don't be surprised by the abundance of rainbow flags. For Vienna, this has long been one of the most prominent events of the year.
And now a story for those who enjoy free events and would like to meet more local residents. The Neubau district has launched a new season of the Neubau Tanzt, Neubau Dances, project. The concept is wonderfully simple: dancing in the middle of the city at various outdoor venues. Every Thursday from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m., a mobile dance floor will travel between different locations around the district. Each session features a different dance style, among them tango, salsa, contemporary dance, classic ballroom programs, and much more. And participation is open even to those who have never danced before. The only requirement is to show up and not be afraid to take that first step. What makes this project special is the wonderfully informal atmosphere it creates. You can not only dance, but also get to know your neighbors, make new friends, or simply enjoy a lovely summer evening. For many people who have recently moved to Austria, events like this often prove to be one of the easiest ways to integrate into local life. No ticket to buy, no registration to complete, no special skills required. Participation is completely free. So if you feel like spending a little less time at home and experiencing authentic neighborhood-level Vienna, Neubau-Tanzt could be just the reason you need to step outside. One more interesting story concerns how Vienna plans to reshape its districts in the coming years. In the Meidling district, the city is preparing a project called a low-traffic neighborhood, Verkehrsberuhigtes Quartier. In plain language, this means a neighborhood where through traffic will be significantly reduced. The idea is to stop cars from using residential streets as shortcuts across the district. Local residents and delivery services will still be able to drive through, but incidental through traffic will be greatly reduced. Why does the city want to do this? The authorities' argument is fairly straightforward. Fewer cars means less noise, cleaner air, and safer streets for children and pedestrians. Similar projects are already operating in many European cities, particularly in London, where they sparked lively debate. Some people welcome such changes, while others find them inconvenient for drivers. In Vienna, a final decision has not yet been taken. Consultations with district residents are still ongoing. But the very emergence of such a project signals the direction in which the city is moving. Vienna is investing more and more in cycling infrastructure, public transport, and comfortable public spaces. So if you have noticed that the city has acquired more cycle lanes and pedestrian zones in recent years, this is all part of precisely that strategy. For the time being, nothing is changing for residents of Meidling. But this is certainly a development worth following.
And now, a story that could only have come from Vienna. If you have been living here for a while, you have probably noticed that Viennese people have a very particular relationship with the subject of death. What would be considered a gloomy topic in many countries is here frequently the occasion for a joke, and quite a refined one at that. Last week, the Bestattungsmuseum Wien, Vienna Funeral Museum, which operates on the grounds of the famous Zentralfriedhof, Central Cemetery, unveiled a new souvenir. At first glance, nothing out of the ordinary, just a luggage strap. But it is the inscription that makes it. It reads, Reise vor dem Sterben, sonst reisen deine Erben, meaning, travel before you die, otherwise your heirs will do the traveling. And in that one sentence lies the essence of Vienna. Because this is not simply a joke about death. It is simultaneously dark humor, a reminder not to put life on hold, and a very Austrian brand of self-deprecating wit. From the outside, it might seem odd that a funeral museum should be selling such things. But the Bestattungsmuseum Wien has long been known for its unusual merchandise and its distinctive sense of humor. Here you can find postcards, mugs, calendars, and other items that play on the theme of death in the way that only Viennese people seem to know how. And if you have ever wondered why there is so much talk in Vienna about cemeteries, funeral traditions, and the idea of a good death, it is no coincidence. Wiener Trauerkultur, Viennese funeral culture, is an entire cultural phenomenon that has been taking shape for centuries. So the new luggage strap is not just a souvenir. it is a small piece of something very specifically Viennese. And if we are honest, there is a certain wisdom in that joke. Because while we keep putting off travel, rest, and dreams, life carries on regardless. And as for the strap itself, that luggage tag is the one you will definitely spot first on the airport conveyor belt. And finally, a less amusing story, but a considerably more practical one. With the arrival of warmer weather, the Asiatische Tigermücke, the Asian tiger mosquito, Aedes albopictus, has once again become active in Vienna. And if you have not yet heard of it, you almost certainly will soon. According to data from Vetmeduni Wien, the University of Veterinary Medicine Vienna, this species has already established itself firmly in certain parts of the city and is gradually spreading further. The name comes from the characteristic black and white stripes on its body and legs. It looks rather striking, but it is not the kind of encounter most people are keen on. The main issue is that this mosquito behaves completely differently from the mosquitoes we are used to. Most people know that mosquitoes are active in the evening, near bodies of water, or at night. That means you can walk through the park or sit on a terrace during the day in relative peace. With the tiger mosquito, that principle does not apply. It actively bites during the day, on walks, picnics, bike rides, or simply when you are sitting at an outdoor cafe. Many people also report that its bites are more painful than those of ordinary mosquitoes, and the itching can last longer. Experts are monitoring the situation, and there is no cause for panic. However, there are a few simple things that genuinely help. If you have a balcony, terrace, or garden, regularly check for spots where water might be collecting. Old buckets, pot saucers, watering cans, paddling pools, and plant holders are all ideal breeding grounds for the tiger mosquito. And if you plan to spend a lot of time outdoors, especially in parks or green areas, it is worth keeping a repellent to hand and using it not just in the evenings, but during the day as well. It seems Vienna has acquired yet another new resident this summer, one that will take some getting used to. And on that note, we head beyond the city limits to bring you what has been happening across the federal states.
Let's begin in Tyrol, where an event last week had all of Austria talking. For the first time in many years, a protest led to the complete closure of the Brenner Autobahn A13, Brenner Motorway A13, one of the most important transport arteries in Europe. If you don't live in Tyrol, you may have dismissed this as just another traffic story. But for local residents, it means far more. The Brenner Pass sees an enormous flow of freight traffic between northern and southern Europe every single day. For business, this is a vital route. But for the people who live alongside it, it means constant noise, exhaust fumes, and an endless stream of lorries. Residents of the Wipptal Valley have been complaining for years that the situation is getting progressively worse. Some villages effectively exist alongside an international transport corridor. That is why local activists and politicians decided on a radical course of action, staging a demonstration directly on the motorway. Interestingly, the authorities initially banned the protest twice. But the Landesverwaltungsgericht Tirol, Tyrolean Regional Administrative Court, sided with the organizers and permitted it to go ahead. For many Tyrolean residents, this story took on a symbolic quality. People want to show Vienna, Berlin, and Brussels that the problem of transit traffic through the Alps can no longer be swept under the rug. The region's great hope is the Brenner Basistunnel, Brenner Base Tunnel, a monumental railway project beneath the Alps which is intended, in the future, to shift a significant volume of freight from the roads onto the rails. But the tunnel's opening date keeps being pushed back, and Valley residents continue to wait. Many believe the motorway blockade will not be the last of its kind. Now to news from Lower Austria, Niederösterreich, which may be of particular importance to those looking for affordable housing. The state is changing the rules for the allocation of Gemeindewohnungen, municipal housing, and geförderte Wohnungen, subsidized housing. In short, the authorities are trying to make the system more flexible and fairer. Previously, many decisions were made on the basis of a rather rigid set of criteria. You either qualified or you didn't. The plan now is to move to a points-based system. What does this mean in practice? Each life circumstance can add a certain number of points. For example, a lengthy wait on the list, a difficult family situation, having a child with a disability, or being at risk of losing your home. The idea is to better account for people's real-life situations, rather than operating on a one-size-fits-all basis. For many people, this is welcome news. Life rarely fits neatly into standard forms. At the same time, this serves as a reminder of an important point for migrants. In the majority of Austria's federal states, the right to municipal or subsidized housing is linked to requirements relating to legal residence. So if you are planning to register for a housing waiting list, be sure to check the current conditions in your specific municipality. Even neighboring towns can have different rules.
Also in Lower Austria, police have been on the lookout for several months for a very unusual serial thief. And no, this time it is not bicycles, phones, or expensive watches. The man was stealing shoes. Not just any shoes either. According to police, he was primarily interested in women's footwear that people had left outside their front doors, on stairwells, or in front of their apartments. Over the course of his career, he made off with approximately 170 pairs. Police even published photographs of the recovered collection, because now they need to find the owners. And judging by the photos, it is a veritable museum in there. Trainers, sandals, heels, winter boots, every season and style accounted for. What is particularly curious is that investigators do not suspect an ordinary theft for resale. The working theory is that the man may have been acting on a fetishistic fixation with footwear. That is precisely why the story went viral almost immediately across Austrian media. Police are now asking residents to check the published photos. Someone may recognize their own trainers, which mysteriously disappeared a few months back. So if you live in an apartment building and are in the habit of leaving your shoes in the corridor, it may be time to bring them inside. Because as this case shows, even in Austria's otherwise very peaceful everyday life, you occasionally encounter people with rather specific hobbies. And we'll close with some good news from several parts of the country. In Vorarlberg, the Österreichischer Staatspreis Holzbau was awarded for the first time at a national level. For many, that may sound like rather specialist news, but it actually highlights something Vorarlberg has long been famous for, both in Austria and beyond. It is here that innovative buildings made of wood have been created for decades, combining sustainability, energy efficiency, and contemporary design. This year, 2 projects from the region received the top honors. The new Rathaus in Hohenems and the educational complex Schulen in Hittisau. And now to Styria and Salzburg. Here is good news for those who travel by regional train. The Styrian regional government has decided to electrify the Murtalbahn, a historic railway line between Unsmarkt and Tamsvig. Today this line still runs on diesel trains, even though many European routes have long since switched to electric traction. After modernization, the trains will be quieter, more environmentally friendly, and more comfortable. For local residents, that means not only less noise and fewer exhaust fumes, but also the prospect of better transport links between mountain regions. Stories like these rarely make the front pages of newspapers, but they are often the ones that have the greatest impact on the quality of life for people living in the regions.
And to close, let us briefly recap the most important points. First, Vienna's new Top- und Ride system is now live. At the stations Hauptbahnhof, Westbahnhof, Bahnhof Meidling, Stephansplatz, Schwedenplatz, Spittelau, Zieglergasse, Neubaugasse, and Erdberg, you can now pay for your journey with a regular bank card, a smartphone, or a smartwatch. Second, if you are thinking about Austrian citizenship, Staatsbürgerschaft, do not put it off indefinitely. Political circles are actively debating raising the language requirement from the current B1 level to B2 or even C1. No decision has been taken yet, but the discussion is ongoing. And third, amendments have now come into force to the Asyl- und Migrationspakt Anpassungsgesetz, Asylum and Migration Pact Adaptation Act, and the Niederlassungs- und Aufenthaltsgesetz, Settlement and Residence Act. If you are dealing with asylum, a residence permit, a Rot-Weiss-Rot Charta, or family reunification, make sure you check the current rules at migration.gv.at and through official bodies. And most importantly, do not put your paperwork off until later. In Austria, rules may change slowly, but once changes come into force, relying on outdated information from Facebook, Telegram, or online forums becomes genuinely risky. Check official sources, keep track of updates, and protect your time, your nerves, and your money. That brings today's episode to a close. Thank you for being with us this week. We will keep you informed about the most important events. Subscribe to the weekly podcast Rot-Weiss-Rot Report, the podcast for those who live and work in Austria. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Spotify. That's all for now. Speak to you in a week.